Good evening. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so genuinely excited to share with you so much information about one of my most favorite songs that I've heard in opera, and information from a project that I've been working on for nearly 2 years. To start off, if we didn't have enough humor already, I'd like to now share with you a little bit more humor, because this is Rossini, is it not? The first thank you of the night is to Boozy and Hawks and their 1956 edition of the Barbiere. In the last few measures, 245 through 253, where Figaro sings "Bravo Figaro, bravo bravissimo, bravo Figaro, bravo bravissimo," you just heard it at the end of the song. I'd like to share with you the English translation out of the Boozy and Hawks, because I believe Dennis Noble sings it in his 1928 recording. Other people have sung it. However, it's the English poetic translation. Now, about poetic translations, they're not literal translations. They say the gist or the idea of what is being communicated, and they extend it over the same strong beats with the nouns and verbs in the right places, but they don't always line up exactly or translate 100%. So Boozy says, "Bravo Figaro," just kidding. That's the Italian. Boozy and Hawks say, "Just come and tell me the long and the short of it. Don't undersell me, I soon will make sport of it. I am a wonder, never blunder. I am the one you all ought to know. If you are hateable, I'll make you mateable. If you are hissable, I'll make you kissable. Don't be tragic, come try my magic. Don't be slow to come say hello. Your troubles are only bubbles. Now that you know just where you can go, bring all your woe to Figaro. Si Figaro." As a young baritone, one of the arias I studied at length was Largo al factotum from Rossini's Il Barbiere di Sivilia. I noticed that many of the well-known baritones did not sing the same ornaments, and furthermore, that the ornaments sung were not in the score. This sparked an interest and led me to this study and analysis of the ornaments used in Largo al factotum during the age of recordings, 1900 through the present day. The baritones in the study have not only performed and recorded the aria, but have performed the role of Figaro in Il Barbiere, either at La Scala in Milan or at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. There are 33 of these baritones. During the bel canto era of 19th century Italian opera, singers were expected to supply vocal ornaments for use in performance, often in collaboration with composers or singing coaches. Skill in improvising these ornaments in performance was gained through extensive study and practice of vocal exercises. During any performance, the degree of ornamentation to present was in the hands of the singer and might vary from night to night, depending on the singer's vocal health, audience response, and other similar factors. The arias sung in an opera were the focus of the embellishments. Many arias from the Baroque and classical periods were composed with segments of melody repeated, or contained a melody that could be easily embellished. When a section or melody was repeated in the Baroque da capo aria, for example, the performer was expected to interpolate his own ornaments, whether improvised on the spot or predetermined, pre-rehearsed, to showcase his strengths, virtuosity, and musicianship. In the late classical and early romantic periods, Gioacchino Rossini, Vincenzo Bellini, and Gaetano Donizetti, as well as other early 19th century composers, understood that these conventions would lead to the embellishment of their music. In embellished opera arias, A.R. Caswell, a scholar of opera performance practice, documents ornamentation practices from the bel canto era by Giuditta Pasta, among others. Pasta was a soprano who performed many Rossini roles. Records and notebooks like Pasta's provide valuable examples in the types of ornaments that were used by singers of this period. Many records exist that also provide recommendations in ornamentation from the composer himself. Singers studying these roles and ornaments should remember that Rossini created these roles for professionals, Many of the notes and ornaments he wrote in separate notebooks were for, after the opera's premieres, were for dilettantes or inexperienced performers. Rossini took care to compose ornaments catering to the strengths of each performer. A plethora of resources exist for female roles, while ornamentation provided for male roles, the baritone in particular, is much more limited. Doing an analysis of one of the most popular arias written for baritone provides a unique and entertaining challenge. Of the bel canto male roles, the baritone role of Figaro is among the most well-known in the operatic repertoire. Figaro's aria has frequently been heard in auditions, recitals, and concerts. However, it has also appeared in cartoons, movies, and commercials, which has made it recognizable to the opera novice. In Figaro's aria, performers often add ornaments as a modern performance practice device. The use and positioning of these embellishments differs by performer. This analysis will bring to knowledge of performance practice in Largo al factotum to singers preparing for the role or the aria. Timing, grace, and direction, as well as correct placement and appropriate usage of ornaments and cadenzas, are skills and techniques applicable to all voice types. Ornamentation has been an accepted and expected practice since the beginning of opera, as evidenced by surviving embellishments in the aria Possente Spirito from Monteverdi's Orfeo in 1607. Christoph Willibald Gluck was one of the prominent composers between the Baroque and Classical periods, moving a little bit later. During this time, men like Rousseau, Winckelmann, and Algarotti began to call for reform in art and a return to simplicity. The most influential, Algarotti, wrote a treatise in 1755 entitled Saggio sopra l'opera in musica, or a treatise on the opera, which undoubtedly influenced Gluck. Gluck and others believed that singers were no longer using ornamentation to serve the drama and the text, but were instead taking away from the art form by adding superfluous ornaments to showcase their own voice and talents. Gluck wrote a preface to his opera Alceste, another example of simplicity, truth, and naturalness. Gluck explained, "I have sought to restrict music to its true purpose of serving the poetry as regards the expression and the situations of the fable, without interrupting the action or chilling it with useless and superfluous ornaments, and I have believed that it could do the same thing for the poetry as vivacity of color and a well-varied contrast of light and shade do for a correct and well-ordered drawing." Some composers and audience members, like the Baroque singer and teacher Piero Francesco Tosi, have documented that the practice could easily be abused, the practice of adding ornaments. Tosi explains, quote, "On the last cadence, the throat is set a-going like a weathercock in a whirlwind, and the orchestra yawns." An informative account by Giuseppe Radicotti, a Rossini biographer, relates how Rossini felt about ornamentation involving a young singer, Adelina Patti. When Patti sang the aria Una voce poco fa from il barbiere, quote, enriched with ornamentations, roulades, and cadenzas for Rossini, unquote, a smiling Rossini asked her who had written the aria she had just performed so beautifully. Radicotti explains, to cheer up the disconcerted young lady, the maestro improvised a paraphrase on the name of her singing teacher, the impresario Maurizio Stracosci. He says in Italian, "Non l'ho riconosciuta perché probabilmente è stata cambiata dal vostro professore che la stracoscionè." Or in other words, "I have not recognized it because probably it has been changed by your professor who has stracoscionized it." Despite the reform in opera, as explained in evidence by Gluck, performers in the early 19th century eventually began to incorporate ornaments more consistently in their performances. As a result of these performance practices, singers since then have been faced with the decision of whether or not to add ornaments in the roles they perform. As performers began to sing ornaments in the same places of an aria, the addition of ornaments eventually became an expectation. Thus, this performance practice soon became a tradition in the mind of the singer, as well as the opera aficionado. Early audio recordings from cylinders and records have also aided in creating this expectation. Upon hearing ornaments frozen in time by recordings by famous singers, singers and conductors alike began expecting more from singers than what was printed in the score by the composer. As recordings from famous performers became available to the public, audience members and performers viewed those combinations of ornaments to be the standard. The performers of the time were then judged against these standard recordings. The singer then chose to either follow the same ornaments that had been recorded, to come up with his own ornaments, or perform a combination of the two. Will Crutchfield describes ornamentation in the bel canto period by explaining, Il Barbiere di Sivilia was composed at a time when liberal variation of vocal lines was still central to the operatic interpretation, to the public's appreciation of performances, and to the singer's craft. The practice of adding ornaments began during the Renaissance period, circa 1430 to circa 1600. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the intent of the ornamentation was to decorate the vocal line by adding scale passages, trills, mordents, or appoggiaturas to the melodic line. It was customary for soloists to embellish the chorus, refrain, or a repeated section of a song to showcase their vocal strengths and abilities. Coloratura, the Italian word meaning to color or to add color to, can be added to an aria in a number of ways. One way is to establish patterns, known as turns or gruppetti, and repeat them at different intervals. These may follow diatonic or chromatic scales, up or down, with small variations or gruppetti, or may also follow an arpeggio of the chordal structure of the aria. To provide more musical or dramatic contrast, a cabaletta section of an aria may require a significant departure from the melody, rather than a simple note or two. Many times these lines were given a more intricate variation, further setting it apart from the original melodic material. Another reason to alter the melody is when, quote, the vocal line takes the form of fioritura over simple chordal accompaniment. In this case, certain singers may change or exchange one melodic passage or theme for another, and insert them ad libitum. This was done to accommodate the melody to the singer's own voice, or as Crutchfield states, for the sake of surprise and variety. Singers used ornaments to accommodate their range of tessitura. Singers and composers used puntatura, or the practice of adding unstemmed noteheads, or punti, above or below the melodic line, to mark notes in order to accommodate for the differences in tessitura. In this manner, if a singer's voice was too low for the role of Figaro, or too high for the role of Rosina, a few passages could be slightly altered with puntatura to make the role more accessible for the singer. By changing the tessitura, the singer could then showcase certain strengths and abilities he could not have before accomplished. The art of improvising florid embellishments reached its height during the bel canto era of singers. Once, when called upon to read an aria for a new opera, Manuel Garcia, the tenor who premiered the role on La Villa in Barbiere, sight-read the aria perfectly. The composer, however, was disappointed, and then asked Garcia to improvise his own ornaments on the spot. A daunting task for a composer, as you can imagine. After doing so in the aria, the composer expressed his great delight at Garcia's interpretation and the ornaments sung, stating that that was exactly what he had intended. As Garcia demonstrated, singers had the ability to make the simple yet beautiful music on the page come to life for the audience and composer alike. Donald J. Grout states, "It must never be forgotten in dealing with Italian opera of this period that everything depends on the singers. Composers most often wrote their parts with certain singers in mind, and many a melody that looks banal enough on the page becomes luminous with meaning when sung by one who understands the Italian bel canto and the traditions of this type of aria." Unquote. Very few bel canto operas, have remained as popular as Rossini's Barber of Seville. La Cenerentola by Rossini was also popular, as were a small handful of others, Lucia di Lammermoor and The Elixir of Love by Donizetti. But much of the repertoire that is performed now, including revivals, came about through the scholarship of academics and performers such as Maria Callas, Joan Sutherland, and Richard Bonney in the 1950s and 60s, and still continues today. Part of the reason for this lack of literature is due to the influence of other Romantic composers, such as Wagner, and the rise of popularity of their music. Audiences grew to love the large, lush sound of opera in the Romantic period, and little by little, operas in the 1950s and 60s began to be revived, thanks to the scholarship of these people. In The Barber of Seville, Figaro is the helpful facilitator of the romance between Rosina and the Count Almaviva. The role of Figaro is one of the most beloved roles because of his mischievous and buffo nature, which stems from Commedia dell'arte, influenced from the characters Arlecchino and Sardi. These two characters were typically portrayed as valets or jesters, much as Figaro is in The Marriage of Figaro by Mozart, whose conniving plots intend to thwart the educated, while often themselves getting duped in the end. Figaro is a man who not only views himself as the most important person in town, but who considers himself brilliant when faced with the task of outwitting Dr. Bartolo. The character of Figaro was born in Pierre de Beaumarchais' play, Le Barbiere de Sivilia, in 1773. Figaro is comically made out to be smarter than the upper middle class Dr. Bartolo. And in the sequel, Le Mariage de Figaro delivers an inflammatory monologue, stating that all Count Almaviva had to do in order to gain privilege was to be born. This comment, coming from someone of the lower class, Figaro, was very controversial and quickly led to the play being banned from the stage by King Louis XVI. Figaro first appeared in opera in Giovanni Paisiello's Il Barbiere di Sivilia in 1782, and later in Mozart's Le Nozze di Figaro in 1786. People in any era relate to the theme of the common peasant overcoming obstacles of class or circumstance. Figaro is clever, humorous, and creative, which are all traits that demand admiration. Many of these traits are shown not only in the events of the opera, for example, his ideas to dress the Count up as a soldier, then as a music teacher, and the often staged unexpected kiss on the lips with Dr. Bartolo, but especially in Largo al factotum, Figaro's entrance aria. The personality of Figaro is anything but rigid. He is smooth, flexible, and changes with the wants and needs of his clientele. These characteristics in character allow the singer or interpreter of the role to slow the tempo when desired, as well as add notes or phrases to paint the text. Figaro especially paints the text with ornaments when talking about how jovial and admired he is. As the singer adds to the music and written line, his character becomes more alive, dynamic, and exciting. When listening to baritones today, both in the recordings released in the present day, as well as in local and regional concerts and competitions, some ornaments in this aria are frequently heard. When did these ornaments come into popularity and become a standard performance practice? Have they always been that way? Of the ornaments and cadenzas analyzed, the most popular ones today usually include a number of high G's or high A's, or both. Over time, these powerful high notes have become expected when listening to the aria, whether in concert or in a production of the opera. Of course, there are many factors that audience members, judges, or even directors may listen for. The timbre of the voice, the personality used in the interpretation of the role, how well the voice sits in the tessitura, etc., rather than listening solely for the high notes. Nonetheless, the natural tendency is to listen and see if the performer will ascend successfully up to the anticipated high notes and cadenzas. After all, we are talking about baritones and high notes. There are a few ornaments that stand out as the most anticipated ornaments in the entire piece. First of which is measure 1/50, which involves a G4, achieved by ascending a G major arpeggio from G3 up the scale to G4, and then sustaining it for a measure or two until the orchestra comes back in. This note is often tied over into the next phrase of "Ah, che bel vivere." The next ornament is immediately following in measure 157, sometimes allowing only 1 or 2 breaths before the fioritura. In this cadenza, which is not notated at all in Rossini's original score, the baritone sings C3 and ascends up an arpeggio to E and G, and then comes down to F sharp, goes back up to A4, and then down the scale to C3 and ending often up at C4 with middle C. The singer may do all of this in one breath to complete the phrase "Che bel piacere." This cadenza is sung as fast or slow as the singer prefers. There are 2 other opportunities for the singer to interpolate a high A. The ornament from measure 83 indicates in Rossini's score a possible A on the word bravo, and the ornament from measure 203 shows that the singer can interpolate a high A on the word per of the phrase per carità, the 3rd time the phrase is sung. These are not used nearly as often as the previous ornaments mentioned, but still give the baritone an opportunity to color his aria with other high notes, showing more personality for this colorful character. In analyzing performers from different eras and cultures, it is understood that many of the baritones involved in the analysis used different musical scores and editions of the Barber Seville. If the performers did, by some fluke of nature, use the exact same score in every performance, which is not the case, it must still be remembered that many opera conductors and directors have preferences where ornaments and cadenzas are concerned. Therefore, where the performers and their interpretation are being analyzed, it is understood that there are other artistic factors that may have influenced their performance. The first ornament begins before the first line of lyrics in the aria. Just as the last ornament in the analysis is a series of la 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 that can be sung in unison with the first violins to the last measure, this ornament is at the beginning of the aria, measures 37 through 41. Only 2 singers in this analysis perform the ornament, Basiola in 1935 and Tito Gobbi in 1946. After singing la 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 4 times, Figaro then enters the scene for the first line of text, Largo al factotum della città, meaning, make way for the jack of all trades of the city. After this line, Rossini writes a G4 as the first note of the phrase for the baritone to immediately show the vocal ability of the singer. The next la 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 line that follows, measure 56 to 58, Rossini composes an E as the final note for the singer. The G and E from measure 50 and 58 respectively are often sung out of rhythm with a slight fermato, making the high notes all the more extravagant. The alternate ornament here is the baritone replacing the G4 with the G an octave lower, and in the following phrase, replacing the high E, which is a 3rd above, and staying on the middle C. This effect may not be as impressive, but the end result is up to the skill and interpretation of the performer. The baritones who use this alternate ornament are Giuseppe Campanelli in 1900, Carlos Francisco, and Emilio de Golosa. All make sing the variation as mentioned. Battistini in 1903 and De Luca in 1917 quickly sing a brief high G in the first ornament, but then sing C in place of the E in the second system. Mario Basiola also sings a variation similar to this ornament in measure 87. Rather than ascending to the E when the phrase is repeated, he stays on C. In observing the dates, it is apparent that this ornament was not sung often in the last 100 years, as the last performer was in 1935, and before that was De Luca in 1917. At this point, a cut is made in the aria that begins with measure 66 and lasts until measure 156. The singer then continues by singing piacere, but then sings the large cadenza normally interpolated in measure 157, rather than the simple eighth notes found in the score for measure 66 or measure 157. The baritones who choose to include this cut are from earlier recordings, Campanati, Francisco, and Diego Borsa in 1900, 1901, and 1905. The purpose of this cut could exist for multiple reasons. It could be to reduce the amount of recording time so that the whole song may fit comfortably on a record of this period, or it could be used when performing the aria in concert and not in the opera. Of course, the use of this cut could also be because the singer wished the aria to be performed at this length rather than singing another 90 measures. In measure 66, on the final syllable of the text, piacere, the singer is given the opportunity to add an ornament during the fermata on the eighth note rest in the orchestra. The ornaments sung are either at a turn, singing that pitch, moving up a step, descending two, and then ascending back up to the original pitch, or a leap of a third from C to E, and then descending back to C, or a combination of the two. Of course, there are other possibilities, but these are the ornaments done in this analysis, with little exception. These are the ornaments performed in this analysis, with little exception. The most commonly used ornament is the turn on C, followed by a leap to E, and a descent to D and C, sung by 15 of the 24 singers who ornament this passage. The men who do this are Battistini, Diego Borsa, Ruffo, Tibbet in 1930, Gopi in 1946, Merrill in 47 and 58, Bastianini in 56, Mills in 74, Leonucci in 82 and 88, Hagegard in 92, and Hampson in 94. Those who only do the ascent, 7 of the 24 singers, and are De Luca, Granforte, Baziola, Merrill, and Braun in 2008. Dennis Noble in 1926 sings a turn on C twice instead of once. And another ornament not typically sung is a descending scale from C4 to C3, sung by Mattia Battistini in 1903. Lawrence Tibbet also takes a different approach when he sings a turn and a half, by ascending to D, coming down to B, and then up to D again, only to return to C.